Dear friends, dear everybody, good afternoon. We're here today under the invitation of ResMedNet, and thank you again, to cover a topic that is essential for all activities that's very dear for us, which is development of new medicinal products, ATMP products for patients, cell and gene therapy products. And we can only do that if we do it in collaboration. I mean, partnerships are essential for everything that we do. We need to do it together, and together we'll do it better. Before we go into the panel, just a small introduction. Myself, Miguel Forte, CEO of Advanced Therapeutics. I'll have the pleasure to lead the discussion today, but everybody else here is more expert than myself in the successful partnership topic that we're discussing. Shall I hand over to each one of you? Jeff Leiter to start.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Leiter, and I'm the CEO of Luminary Therapeutics. I've been in the cell and gene therapy space for about 12 years now. I've had the good fortune of being on the CDMO side as well as on the tool side, and now I'm on the therapeutic side.
Nicole Faust, I am the CEO of CEVEC. We are a company specialized in production technologies, so we are developing production technologies for viral vectors, in particular for AAV vectors, and we're working with the product developers on the one hand, and then also with the CMOs who will then take over production.
I'm Joe Garrity. I am the Director of Autologous Cell Therapy for Commercial Development within Lonza. Lonza is a large biologics company with a cell and gene therapy CDMO service. I've been in the cell and gene space for about 10 years in a myriad of different functions, splitting between operations, process development, and business function.
My name is Brian Mullen. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at Ipos-Gezi. So Ipos-Gezi is a CDMO in the viral vector area. We're part of a larger group called SK Pharmaceuticals. I've spent about 20 years in the biotech pharmaceutical industry, starting with gene therapies and then moving into monoclonal antibody, technical development, launch, commercial supply before returning to gene therapies in October about 18 months ago.
Thank you all. So the topic of today is dear to my heart. I've been involved myself in different technologies, autologous cell therapy, gene-modified cell therapy, regenerative tissue approach. On all of those, one has to do strategic decisions, like in bone therapeutics. Do we manufacture in-house? Do we outsource? How do we make those choices? And really what I would like us to discuss to start off is precisely the process of making those choices, the consideration that we have to go through in terms of selecting that partnership. And as Jeff mentioned, I think we have had the opportunity of being in different positions and taking different decisions in terms of making that selection. And I'd like to point out to you a few topics that I would like us to go and discuss. So when we are deciding a partner, when we are deciding what CMO, CDMO we want to work with, what are the considerations that come to your mind first? I mean, what do you look for? How do you prioritize? Jeff, shall we start with you?
Sure, and I think we want to cover both aspects of product developer as well as a CDMO. So I'll start with the product developer. From my perspective, being on the other side as a product developer now, I'm looking for a CDMO that effectively not only has the competency and the experience to be in the business, but has that kind of high level of touch where I feel like my therapy, which is our child that we've kind of born, if you will, is going to be well taken care of inside of when I let it go into a CDMO.
I think, Jeff, what you're touching on a point which I'd like to reflect on the others, which is the fitness between the two. How do the two fit? The one that has the product, the one that will help developing the product. It's a bit like taking your son or your daughter to school. You want it to be taken well care for, right?
Right, exactly.
Nicole, any thoughts on this? And not about taking to school, but a product to the CDMO.
I could comment on either. No, definitely. And I think you're raising a very important point here, because what we are seeing when we work with the product developers and they trust us to develop a producer cell line for them, it's very important that you actually have the scientific expertise in your team to actually discuss with them what their needs are. They need to feel that you understand what they need to have in the end. And I also think it's important that you really build a relationship between the technical teams as well, so you can really establish trust, and also you have to be able to really have an in-depth scientific discussion with them about their products and what they will require you to do.
Technical, the partnership. Joe, I think obviously you come here, but you have good multiple experience. You come here on the receiving hand. Mm-hmm. So how do you respond to this?
Yeah, and I think partnership is the perfect word, because coming from a large CDMO like Lonza, it can be very easy to interpret Lonza as a service provider. But what we look for, and what I'm sure you all have just mentioned, you're looking for that partner. And a partner is more than just, okay, an operations or a manufacturing facility. It's let's learn from one another to best provide what's right for the product and right for the patient. You know, as a CDMO like Lonza, we can provide that demonstrated and proven path to get you where you want to go, but we're not naive enough to think that our way is the only way. You know, let's learn from one another, let's build upon what you have seen in your history versus what we've seen in our history, and then collaborate to ensure that we have the best path forward for the product and the patients.
Yeah, I'll challenge you a little bit. I fully agree with you. I think that fitness, that flexibility, that ability to accommodate the needs is essential. Sometimes people say, well, Lonza is too big for that. Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. I mean, I think it depends, right? So when you say too big, is it because it depends what the company is looking for. If the company is looking for just a quick round of funding with a certain CDMO, then there is early phase adoption, there's late phase adoption. Investors nowadays are looking more towards, okay, what's your long-term path? This is no more the large amount of seed funding, Series A, that we've seen grow in the network without that long-term path to commercial. The goal of every drug product is to get it to commercial to serve the patients. So there isn't really that gap. So the too big comment I get, I have heard it myself a lot, but I would say it's a little bit more of a focus on qualitative earlier on, even if not necessarily seen outside of the CDMO services. We want to focus on that commercial viability early on to really help, again, speed up the path to market versus just getting something quick into clinic.
I think we're going to come back to some of those topics, because here we're talking about the match, but that there'll be elements, knowledge and other elements that will come into it to make that match. But
I would echo the comments of the previous, the other panelists. It's a partnership, which means it's not a series of transactions. And it also needs to be flexible or adaptable, because at the time you enter into this partnership, I think you can be fairly guaranteed that the situation is going to change. So if it's going to be transactional, everyone is going to be looking at the fine print of what we signed up for. If it's adaptable and flexible, we will try, to Joe's point, work with each other to try to bring what we do best to make the best solution. And the other thing is with some of these therapies, there are patients waiting for them. They're moving fast for good reasons, because many of them don't have other solutions. This is being supported by health authorities, so I don't think the patients have the time for us to make organizational or partnership mistakes and have to reverse out of it and find other CDMOs. So we do need to work together to move these things forward.
I resonate to the point you're making about all of this is done with the intention to commercialize, i.e. access to the patient, and that should be first in our minds. And anyway, so as we consider to engage on a partnership, and I'll leave you for last, what would be your process of decision, right? I mean, what would you analyze, prioritize, and secondarize, so to speak, in terms of deciding for a CDMO to work with?
Yeah, so for us, we are really, in many cases, actually looking for a CDMO for our clients because they trust us with the cell line development, and then we transfer the cells to the CMO, we transfer the process to the CMO. So we really need to feel confident in the CMO's capabilities, also in their technical flexibility, because it's, I mean, in the cell and gene therapy space, it's all new technologies, it's all developing. So of course it needs to be GMP and it needs to be standardized processes, but it also needs to be possible to establish something new. So the D has to be big in that CDMO, I would say, from our perspective. And then also what we're seeing from our clients is that they would prefer a CDMO who's done it before. So we're really trying to establish preferred partners, to not to go to a new CDMO each time, but to have some trusted partners here that we can really refer our clients to.
Jeff, could you structure your thoughts there as well? I mean, what is
Sure.
the top one and the lowest one, so to speak?
So again, kind of thinking a little bit from the developer side as opposed to the CDMO side.
Yeah, you can do that.
I think the process is first to really tease out, is the competency there? And what I mean by that, it's not that different than working with a large consulting firm that sometimes your first interactions are with highly competent people, but then the work's going to be turned over to technicians that may or may not be as competent. So my first process step would be kind of really understand what's underneath the people selling the product and who are their operators and their technicians. The second thing that I think becomes really important is really teasing out how developed is the process that is already being tech transferred into the CDMO, because I think the first point of tension is when the CDMO works to make it very GMP compliant, very repeatable, very standardized, and if it's been loosely baked together, that's an immediate tension point. So I think the second step is to understand, where are those differences? Is this a very rigid quality CDMO and they're going to kind of take everything down to the level? Or is it somebody that has a group that thinks, well, heck, we can change the process a little bit on our own, and on the other side, it's very well developed. So those are the first two steps that I take, and then obviously financial considerations would be the third.
Okay, I think there will be an additional one, but I'll wait to see if Brian mentions it.
For us, it's the fit again, back to your point about fitness, but at two levels. I would say a rough fit, does this fit in with our capabilities, our expertise? Could we do this? But the other thing is a little bit about the ambition of the program. And some cases, for us at Ipuscesi, we do decline programs because it fits with our capability, but it may be that the program is too aggressive and the expectations are too high and there is too much, I would say, responsibility on us to deliver. We may not want that stress for our internal teams, but we may think there might actually be another better partner out there who can do this, who is more capable of working with this stress goals. And so again, that comes back to fit. Can we be a reliable partner for this product developer to move this thing forward?
So Joe, to you. Fit, quality, financials, I would add flexibility, adaptability.
Yes, I think all of it kind of goes into the fit, right? So our first focus when we're looking at fit is quality. So as Jeff mentioned, quality is really the center of most CDMOs. They want to bring in a quality product. But I'll go a little bit further and I'll touch on phase-appropriate quality, because an early clinical phase 1 is going to be treated different than a late phase pre-commercial type of opportunity. The quality requirements are slightly different, so we'll take into account that. But we want to make sure that quality is kind of at the forefront, because again, this is a cell therapy where the drug product itself is being manufactured, so we want to assure safety by the customer as much as possible. And then quality also doesn't necessarily just mean safety to the patient, it means a smooth transition, and smooth is fast. So from a fit perspective, we want to kind of build upon again, what you all had mentioned, the demonstrated path forward. So again, learn from the demonstrated path with the high quality standards that are phase appropriate to allow us to move as quickly through the stages as we can to ensure a smooth delivery to the patient and get into clinic and into market as quickly as possible. I think that's really at the top. Flexibility is very interesting because for me, for autologous manufacturing, this is not a bank that we're starting with. This is patient cells. So you have to have some inherent flexibility built in, or else you're really setting both sides up for fail. I can't go to a customer and say, you must deliver the starting material to me at this particular time on this particular day. There, of course, will need to be a window, of course, but we have to have some sort of flexibility and understanding of what the starting material, the end product is. So creating some sort of unique business fit and operational fit that are married together, that are harmonized not only internally but externally with our customers is extremely critical.
Yeah, I just to add my 2 cents into it. I think like any relationship, you need to feel comfortable with your partner. You need to trust your partner, and it goes through that flexibility, quality, adaptability, affordability, and really when you build all of that, then you come to what we're really talking about, which is a successful partnership, and the word is again partnership. Mm-hmm. Now, behind that partnership is the knowledge that comes into it. And I'd like to move to a slightly different topic that comes into it. It's how do we leverage the knowledge that we bring with the knowledge that the CDMO can provide. It comes very much on top of what we were just saying before, but you own the knowledge, you own the product as a product developer, and I speak myself mostly as a product developer again as well. You own that, and you need to retain it, but you need to be prepared to come to a partner that will tweak it, improve it. That is how I would see that partnership. So if I put to you, and I'll start now on this side, when you receive, let's put it, a client, how much emphasis, how much discussion you put on tweaking the process, improving the D part of the CDMO question?
I'll go back to the initial question or the answer on quality. I think it depends on kind of what your aspirations are for the product and where you are in that clinical phase. The development emphasis could be heavy or it could be light. We've had customers come in that feel that they have a phase appropriate process, but it's not. We also have customers that come in that say they have a phase appropriate process, and it is. So we really want to work and ensure that the expectations and understandings are married together before we really enter into the actual tech transfer phase, so that we can test out the process, we can highlight some risk areas, and then we can put together proper plans for risk mitigation. If out of that risk mitigation, the development of the D part of CDMO comes into play, then sure, we will manage it. But also we will have different levels. We will have nice to haves, we will have need to haves. You need to have this before you enter into the clinical phase that is based off of global or regulatory guidance. And then here your nice to have, something that might not be necessarily needed now, but as you progress through the clinical phases, this is something that's going to be needed pre-commercial before your PPQ runs.
Do you think that different, I'm sure probably that different CDMOs will have a different likeliness or willingness for the D part or more on the M part, right? Mm-hmm. And how do you see that from Lonza perspective? Because I think it plays into the big size and the flexibility, because you will need that flexibility if you do the D part, mm-hmm. and you should have, and I know you do, inside of your organization's pockets are able to do that, but then you also have the capacity to go further into commercialization and larger scale. Mm-hmm. So is there a preference? Is there a difference between CDMOs about that?
I think so. I mean, again, I think it comes back to what the CDMO's goal or business model or operational model really is. There are CMOs out there without the D that focus just on manufacturing. We have had customers come in just simply for development so that we can then pass it back to them. We'll get them to, their GMP compliant phase and then pass it back to them. We don't necessarily have to do the manufacturing. Of course, we would like to, but we don't necessarily have to. And I think that's strongly because our process development team was built out to be a large part of our success. But when we first started out, process development was much smaller, and we really were kind of focusing more on the allogeneic manufacturing side of anything else. This was back when MSCs were all the rage in 2012, 2013. So I'd say there's definitely a different mixture, but it comes down to the area of expertise too. I mean, really look at the teams, and as Jeff, you mentioned, peel the onion back and what's underneath what's being sold. Is this a team that can really develop it better than the customer that's coming to us? Or is this maybe, this could be done in-house and then transferred to us, because we're not going to, lie to ourselves about who has better capabilities. And that's the partnership approach. You want to understand each other very well.
Because I think if we go back to the topic, which is cell and gene therapy, and the fact that the field is evolving and we're still all together, regulatory people included, finding our way through, the D part is essential, right? From your perspective, that D part is an essential component. How do you see it in terms of retaining knowledge, sharing knowledge, really changing our knowledge through the interaction with the CDMO?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, in just what Joe had just mentioned, the ability to kind of communicate very truthfully, right? So as a developer, you come in, you think, well, I've figured this whole thing out. As a CDMO, you've seen 20, 30 different processes, and you know what works and what doesn't. So if the two parties are able to have an honest communication of saying, this part of our process we think we've really nailed, and the CDMO kind of looks at it and says, yeah, I kind of think you have, but this part of the process, we still would like some improvements. Maybe a 3-month process development project before you go into your process qualification runs makes sense. So it really comes down to how can you get to an honest communication about what does and doesn't work.
Yeah. And again, back to you, Brian, on the receiving end, sometimes when you do the assessment, you factor that in, right, in terms of the proposal. You come to me as a CMO, but really what you need is a CDMO. Here's why. Your perspective?
So the purpose of development, and I think this is also why D is before M in the acronym, which is CDMO, is to provide a robust...
Just try and play with the words there.
which is to provide a robust and reliable solution for quality control and for production. So it's not in our interest to speed something through where it will fail in production at QC or in QC at any phase. So we try to establish what is the client looking for. So if it's an AAV vector, they want empty full is a big topic at the moment, so they're looking for, say, 80%. And they will present a process, and we can then say we don't think that process will deliver 80%, or the delivery of 80% is basically a summation of all the points that get there. We may want to check 2 or 3 along the way at various steps to ensure they get there. But we also have some products where it's quite routine. We feel it fits quite comfortably. We might do 1 or 2 checks, and then it moves quite quickly into QC or production. The same thing with QC. If we want to add more IPCs, does the matrix work with the test? So we may have a test. The test may work very well, but we may have never tried it in that matrix before. But either way, we don't want failure either in production or in QC, but we don't want to overblow the development package either. So we try to bring our knowledge, establish trust with the client, and say this is what we feel you need to get to a reliable solution in production and QC, so you can get what you want there, because that's what you're looking for, not a development package, and then you can move on.
In our case, it's since we're again in the middle, a CEVEC between the client and the CMO, maybe I'll go to the relation with the client. So since we with our technology using stable cell lines for AAV production, inducible stable cell lines for AAV production, that's quite unique. So our clients will not come to us with a process they have developed. They come to us with a vector that they have done on a different platform, and they will want us to reproduce it on a better scalable platform. So what we need them to share is analytics, because we want to make sure that we can basically give them a product that matches their needs. So this is the part they really have to share with us, and so far they have been very willing to do that. They weren't giving away anything where they felt they'd be losing, but they'd really be gaining there.
Do any of you have experience where either on the receiving end or as that there was reluctance on sharing information, on saying, this is really my baby and I don't want to tell you everything, right? I mean, obviously, which is a wrong start, I would say. But have we seen this?
From our side, definitely, which is why we have an IP department. Right, so before we even enter into any information sharing, we ensure that all of that information is protected, and I think that's critical. And take it a little bit further. I mean, obviously we have the IP protection, but even if any changes are made, it doesn't mean we own the process. We're just modifying your process, and all of that is contractually agreed upon ahead of time to give the customer a sense of peace of mind that, okay, this information is completely confidential, it's going to remain completely with our customer, none of it comes to us. Of course, there will always be some know-how learnings of standard unit operations, but the confidentiality will never be breached, and the process will always remain in the customer's hands. So I think the IP discussion is always something that is a little bit of a lengthy conversation during MSA negotiations, but that's the IP side is very critical.
It is, because there's IP that is very close to the product, and IP that is very close to the process or the know-how, and really your business, right? So we're talking about the IP of the product and the IP or know-how of your business, right? And it's the matching of the two.
We see a mix as well, but I think we probably need to step back and say what is really intellectual property. So if you want to fine-tune a step halfway through a purification process to remove DNA or proteins, or increase the level of empty capsids, full capsids, I think most people skilled in the art will be able to manage that. So what are you really protecting there? And some companies are quite open with this. They are clients, they will allow us to do it, they will allow us to see the data, and then we can discuss the data, and they're happy when we are able to discuss what we've seen with other projects. But then there are some others who want, us not to see the data and will take all the samples and go off and analyze them themselves, and are not so open about sharing the data. So it's their choice at the end of the day, but I think we need to try to have a think about what do we really need to protect here, and what is important to us, and what we probably should be a little bit more open about sharing. So.
And that's not a good partnership. We go back to the first word, right?
Very much so.
And any comment?
Yeah, I've had kind of a disaster experience once when I was on the CDMO side of a company who said, our process is ready, we want to go into the clinic, and we got to be in the clinic in 2 months, and we got to get 3 PQ runs. And typically in that kind of initial phase, there's, well, what have you done before? Let us understand your process and see some of your data. And they would well, it works every time. And they wouldn't show us any of the analytics. And once we got into the process, it works every time because they change it, which was a disaster for us. So yeah, but it's back to that word partnership. It wasn't really a partnership. It was, we're going to shove this down your throat because we just want to get in and get funding back in the day. So.
Yeah, I think that you've got a very good point, but I think there's 2 elements of the point. One is rush, and I want to get this done, and I wanted to get it tinkered with. The other one is the IP, and I think the IP, and you've said it, you have an IP process that starts before you go on, because in the end, it is important that we safeguard both sides of the IP equation here, the product and what it will be support the product, but also your interests are becoming more and more through experience a good CDMO because of what you accumulate. And there's firewall in terms of what you accumulate and give to others in terms of your ability to deliver, not your ability to translate IP to them. So it's an important context there for sure. If we take this still on this, is this discussion different, or how does it evolve from one point that you raised before, and I was going to come back to it, which is how do we do the discussion for the very beginning, phase 1, phase 2, and for large-scale commercialization? The IP question is probably a lot less relevant at that moment. It's more a mechanical thing, but it's also very, very important, because I would like then to come back later on in the discussion to the strategy that we should do when we go and create a company, form a spin-off to a commercial success, and what's the strategic steps about deciding CDMO versus inside and outside. So How do you see this process at the very end towards the commercialization as well?
So if we're talking about taking a customer from the early stages all the way to commercialization, part of the CDMOs when selecting whether you want to do it internal, external, again, this is a bit redundant, but what have you done in the past? Chances are if you've done in the past, you've adopted some sort of procedure, some sort of policy or milestone-based approach that allows the customer to be able to see step 1, step 2, step 3, all the way to their end goal. At Lonza, we have this thing called the new product introduction. Every time a new product comes in, it's based upon early clinical, mid-stage, late-stage commercial, and it's got a bunch of different check boxes that we need to incorporate. Doesn't mean this is stuff that Lonza needs to do. This is just information that we are sharing with the customer that needs to happen before each stage. So what we want to do is ensure that all these check boxes are occurring at different phases so that the customer can kind of see that pathway. They can see the project Gantt for how long it's going to take to do X, Y, and Z. If they need to modify X and it becomes X1, X2, X3, they also have spin-offs on that. So to kind of show and highlight the path forward before we even do it, I think is something that we like to pursue to help the customer kind of see the value in the CDMO and see the value regardless of what stage you're in. We can give you that value early, we can give you that value late. Chances are too, if you're coming in early, a lot of what's done early on is applicable for late phase. So as you mentioned, if somebody's trying to rush in and get quick and dirty and there's delays up front, okay, you might be able to get into clinic, kind of limp across the finish line into your early phase clinic, but what you did long term was you actually just delayed yourself 12 to 18 months. So I think having that pathway and kind of showing that path and highlighting the risks is what we like to do to try to, again, highlight what brings the value of a CDMO, to give you that, can we do this internal or should we look external?
I'm going to be provocative to Jeff. Should we limp into phase 1 and worry about commercialization later?
I'm gonna use the words of the person that I live with who says, when's a good time to plant a tree? Now. So I think planning ahead, because it is a rigorous road and there are many strategic inflection points, to your point, Miguel, to think through how you're going to, when you're going to see those inflection points and how you're going to be ahead of them. So I think you have to, you don't want to limp into a phase 1. That would not be my recommendation.
Because you'll carry scars.
Exactly.
Nicole, do you agree with that?
I totally agree. I mean, we see the opposite very often, in particular with the small startups or smaller companies who basically forced to rush into the clinic because they've got these investment milestones. It's like, we need to have our IND filed by this and that date. And so it's very hard to get them to think about phase 3 market, because they just feel, I want to get my product into the clinic and then I will find a partner. So these are the customers that really don't follow your advice. And then on the other hand, I mean, obviously when we're talking and working with bigger pharma, it's totally the opposite. They don't even think about filing the IND before they figure out how they want to produce later on for phase 3 and market.
I think probably the word would be not limping, but straining yourself a little bit, because you're right, and I'm sure it's very clear in Jeff's mind, and definitely in mine, is that I mean, we have milestones, we have financials that really need to be complied with in terms of taking our product through different steps. That's the expectation. But I agree with you and Jeff and you, Joe, as well. We need to resist to rush things. Have a sense of urgency, but resist rushing. And I think you, Brian, just have your perspective on this as well. I mean, obviously, kind of you agree, but you have also one aspect, which is the vector business, and I would like your comment, has been. People were claiming, well, there's not enough offer, there's a challenge, we have to wait, there's time delays on this, which impacts this rush that we have.
So to answer that point first, there are delays. Not all of them are under our control, so there are the other elephant in the room being supply chain. We try to manage that as much as possible, but that comes into our timelines as well. To come back on the original question, I think a lot of the regulatory agencies, I think at the start there was flexibility in terms of speed to patient, speed to market. That is now, I would say, correcting or changing, and that certain standards are now being more and more insisted upon. And we actually now start to see this in the type and nature of the projects we see. So a couple of years ago at Ipuscizzi, I think things were really being managed phase by phase. And, you know, where's the start point, what's the end point, what's the deliverable? But I think more recently, even for development packages, the RFPs we say, okay, the focus is on the development package, but we want you to make a proposal for when this is finished, how it's going to go out to market. And they're looking at the bigger picture. And part of this, there are many reasons, but one of them is that there's a reluctance to have to move or chop and change between CDMO partners at this. And the second one is that I think now people are starting to see the bigger picture. This is where I am today and this is what I need, but I would like now to take the time to try to connect the dots to see how this will move out in the next 2 or 3 years.
I think that's obviously very important, which is seeing into the future and being already kind of planning for it, not only on the capacity, your technical aspect, but our strategic decisions in terms of where am I going to manufacture. And if we go on to that topic, Jeff, what are, I would say, your key thoughts about strategic decisions in terms of outsourcing versus in-house, and how do you factor that in for short-term decisions and long-term decisions?
Sure. So I think we kind of covered the shorter-term decisions earlier, where it, you know, as a phase 1 or a phase 2, as a small developer, you're going to, for financial reasons, more likely choose a CDMO just because of the scale where they can spread those costs across many, as opposed to you taking that on unless you got a really big fund. So I think financial kind of drives you early on to a CDMO, especially if you can find the right one that you can build a partnership. But the way I think about it long term, and this was a little bit informed when I worked at PCT, we saw many people that had transferred their assets over to larger GSK type companies, where they were looking to have both a CDMO as well as in-house manufacturing to manage redundancy. And as I think about that now from a developer standpoint, to me from a long-term standpoint, that's where I would want to go, is to have 40% of my manufacturing capacity done in-house and perhaps 60% done externally, just to save resources.
I think there's an aspect of strategy, as Jeff mentioned, but then there's an aspect of timing. So if you take a strategy, what do we want to do? Do we want to move this 1 or 2 assets forward to a certain point in time where it might be attractive to sell? Or am I building a platform here with multiple products that I'm looking at 5, 10, 15 years? Or I want to maintain ownership over this. And then the second thing is economics, and Jeff touched on this. To put a facility together, you're starting at 60, 70 million, and you can start to multiply that up as much as you want. Do you have the financial capacity to manage that for the initial growth of the company, 3, 4, 5 years? At the start, until you get to that 5-year point where you can actually manage it financially, that you've got enough batches in there to pay for it. But at the start, if it's just 2 or 3 batches, this is going to be very expensive to maintain. But I think the balance that you mentioned is probably the right way. Do you want to be 100% out or 100% in terms of manufacturing? Probably is not the way to go. To have some internal and some good partnerships externally is probably the best way to do it. It gives you some choice. There's benefits then from the experience of the external partners combined with your internal experience as well. So that is probably the way to go. And if you look at more mature categories as well, small molecules, biologics, I think this is where the industry is going. There's a lot more outsourcing in monoclonal antibody manufacturing at the moment, but a lot of companies aren't dropping it either. They're still maintaining a footprint.
I think you raised an important point, Brian, when you compare it to small molecules or antibodies. I think at the moment, with at least the perception that the production capacities are still very limited, and so for everybody who can afford to build the production capacities themselves, they want to be independent. That's what we're seeing. They really want to have control over everything and have it in-house and not to have to fight for capacity. But of course, if you're a smaller company, then you have no choice. I mean, you don't have the financials to just build the production site, so you have to go with the CMO. But I guess once they see they're really building up a product pipeline, and that's also what we're seeing, they'll also start to consider building up their own production.
Is this just a financial discussion?
So initially, I would say no. Viral vector, allogeneic manufacturing, not simply a financial discussion, but if I want to address the main market challenge, probably in CGT, the autologous reimbursement, it almost strictly becomes a economics discussion around, can this even be commercially viable from a pricing standpoint? And that's what we see a lot of companies doing, what Jeff, you had alluded to, kind of the split security of supply approach, but also to see, can these guys make it cheaper than we can make it internally? Let's exclude the capital expenditures, because if you're really talking about a large commercial product, of those commercial products that are out there, you're going to need to build. There's no CDMO out there that has 200,000 square feet of space that's ready to go today. The underutilization would be astronomical. So you're going to need to build in some way, shape, or form. So you're going to have lighter capital expenditures, of course, with the CDMO side, heavier if you do it internal, but who can do it the most efficient? And I think, can we leverage some of that experience from a CDMO perspective and do that in-house? If we are seeing the struggles of the market, whether it be recruitment or headcount, being able to acquire that number, maybe we stay with the CDMO. And as you mentioned, I don't want to hire all that headcount. Let's keep it internal. But that's, again, from the autologous perspective. I think from the allogeneic and viral vector side, it's not so much. Again, it's the effectiveness. It's the quality of actually making it once you get to that stage. How efficient can you be at delivering a quality product so you don't have as many turnovers of both the product and really just the process itself internal. So autologous, for me, it's a very sensitive subject, because that is the main challenge, trying to offer things that are within a reasonable cost of goods up against the market reimbursements that we're seeing in the US and EU. But for allogeneic and viral vector, it's a little bit more towards the efficiency of being able to produce and be reproducible over time, have a reproducible, robust process, whether it's internal, external, and ideally, as you said, split it so that you don't have all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah. I think it's important to have a cautious strategy that has a plan to split your risk. I think also when you're in the very beginning of the development, there is a significant risk involved with your product, right? It's high risk and high investment if you wanted to own something. But even if I had all the money, I probably would, in the beginning, rather than building and doing it internally, go back to the point here, which is the partnership, because I think there's quite a lot that you would benefit by challenging your process and your approach by going to a CDMO, right? I mean, even if you know your product the best, which you should, and your process the best, which you must because you've created it, you need to be prepared to have it challenged, and nothing better to have someone do it for you to challenge. So I think strategically, from a technical success point of view, I think a CDMO in the beginning is an important part. Then as you grow and de-risk, you may wish to consider, okay, do I have the money to do the capital investment? Do I have the money to really produce it internally? Or do I have the money to mix it? Probably that's the right approach. Or do I build a very strong relationship with a CDMO that I want to continue? That's also why good partnerships last long, right? And so you may wish to go that way. And also there comes into it also the geography. I'll give two examples that guide some of my thinking. We have a partnership with China, and crossing borders of products with China, which is very, very difficult. So in a way, you're going to have to do something of manufacturing there because of regulatory and geopolitical considerations. At the same time, I also have another example. When I took over Bone Therapeutics, it started as an autologous approach. And because autologous requires all of what you've mentioned, and there was cash available, Bone Therapeutics decided to build and own a manufacturing. But clearly the process evolved to allogeneic cryopreserved off the shelf. So suddenly you had a mammoth that it didn't serve your project, and you made an investment, and so there wasn't enough challenging of what you've done, and there was an investment that really was too high. And then, as I mentioned earlier today, we divested the manufacturing and the people to a CDMO, and in doing so, we actually lighten up our costs and establish the relationship which could continue to build to us. So I would make that point that partnership and doing it together is not just a financial discussion. In the end, money speaks, but it is important because it will be essential to improve what you're doing and challenge what you're doing with the others.
I would concur with what you're saying, and I would throw out just a finer point on it, that you could be giving up a lot of opportunity cost by manufacturing internally when you're better suited to develop the next 2 or 3 products.
Sure. So. No, absolutely. I mean, and again, I think as product developers, that's what we are, product developers, right? And one needs to own, and it goes back to the IP, which is another important one. One needs to own the product, but owning the product, it doesn't mean that you don't want to get it challenged and really have the help outside, which will not only improve what you have, but give you space for other things and eventually other ideas as well.
Right.
If I may, just to link the points that Joe mentioned about reliability and quality, and Jeff's point about your point as well about the challenge and learning from others. If you, as a developer, decide to build a facility, and in the early phase of your portfolio, you may be at 20% facility occupation, how performant do you think that's going to be? Do you think your team will stay to be occupied 20% of the time? How do you think they're learning when they're at 20% of the time? So and then as the facility becomes full, starts to fill out, that's when the team is really learning and growing, and it makes more economic sense then. But if you're at a low occupation rate, you could start to run into quality issues just from lack of development and training and experience with the team.
MFTs anyway, right?
Yes.
No, you see, and that's a very good, very important point, because, as I mentioned before, when there was an autologous process, as there were clinical trials going on, there was a lot of coming in and production. So the manufacturing was being used up, right? When it became allogeneic, it wasn't, right? It was actually an ongoing cost that was not being really properly amortized, properly used. Again, I think the other point is you make the decisions vis-a-vis the conditions you have at the time, which relate to the cash that you have, the process that you have, the opportunities that you have. But that said, you need to have the long-term vision and what you're trading off today. And I think, and I would underline, because I think that's core to what we're saying here today, is partnership, learning together and being better, doing things together. There's a client and provider relationship, but behind that, there is a partnership that will make things better for both sides, for the know-how, because of your multiple experience, and for your product, because of those multiple experiences that you bring into it. If I take it one step further, is how do we put all of this into another kind of partnership, which is big pharma or licensing out of your product? And how do you see that? Because that's an interesting point. You have a partner that is now going to license his product or has been acquired by big pharma. How do you as CDMO see that process? And how do you fit it in there? And then Jeff, obviously, this is our dream, right? I'll come back to you afterwards.
I get it.
So how do you position yourself as a CDMO versus those steps of licensing out or being bought by, or your client being bought by big pharma?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of instances with that where customers have then been bought out and the large pharma takes over. And actually for large CDMOs, it kind of creates a very well-aligned approach because as I think, Jeff, you mentioned earlier, the larger pharmas are usually more focused and more patient to get that end goal in mind, which is what most CDMOs are looking for, that end goal. So when we're looking at that license approach, I think it's critical to kind of understand how the milestones change and how the approach changes as the licensing actions happen and as you kind of have that transition. Any type of how do I say it? Any type of structural change or process change that has happened, you're doing it with a clear plan in place and managing the new expectations that might come in. Because a lot of times when these license products come to us, they're completely different than what we had seen before. Not necessarily in the process, but in the end goal. It's no longer rush, rush, rush. It's more, okay, let's pause, let's take a hold up, let's then, take a look at it from a viability perspective long term. Can we modify this? Can we pause and do a little bit more development? Or can we do development in parallel with some of the clinical trials, do comparability down the road? So from a CDMO perspective, at least within my experience, I like this. I like this because then again, it aligns very well with our own internal policy. It doesn't mean we don't do the other, we just manage it phase appropriately. But this, my main goal is long term, mid to long term. So how do we get this process and make this a viable commercial product? And as the large pharmas take over, that's often the case. However, sometimes the patient's a little bit thin. Is there any risk? It has a lot more risk to disappear. And we've seen this in the market too, where large pharmas will invest in a bunch of different smaller opportunities, knowing that one will hit, the other two will not. So if one comes through and is having a little bit of a hiccup, it's not a surprise if it's gone. So then it gives us a little bit of a challenge and a little bit more of a worry that what is happening today, if there's any bumps in the road, could be gone tomorrow. But I think compared to the vision and compared to the partnerships that will be established with the larger companies being more aligned with what we have, it's a risk that we're happy to take. Yeah.
You feel the same way, Brian?
So at Ipuscesi, we haven't been through those transitions like Joe has in Lonza, but if I take a look at for the larger clients that we work with and the smaller, they seem to look at things very similar, but I think the differences we see is more in sort of the organizational structures and I would say the people that are within and behind those companies. So to be specific, a larger company, when they come in, are going to bring a larger team in that are more specialized, but they're looking at the same endpoints on this. With smaller companies, we see a mix. Some of them are very much focused on the promise of the medication, and for viral vectors, here's a transgene, make me a vector. But we're seeing more and more smaller to medium-sized companies that either have a very good board, advisory board, or have managed to make two very good strategic hires with a chief commercial or chief technical officer who can guide the team to say, keep an eye out from this, and to start to get them to look at 2, 3, 4 years out. And even though all that knowledge is within one person, they're hitting the same points as when the large company comes in with 8 experts in various different domains. So from our perspective, we haven't seen the transition, but from the dealings, they are looking at it in slightly different ways, but looking at the same thing, I would say so.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's really down to the difference between the smaller and large pharma here. It's very much how long they have been in the field, their in-depth understanding of what they really need. And we're seeing everything from clients that know exactly what they need and clients that we need to educate what they need. So it's the whole range. I mean, the big pharma, we usually don't have to educate them, but from the biotechs, we see the whole range. And with pharma, again, some are just starting in the field and they're sort of exploring all the different possibilities, and we're also guiding them through it in a way.
Yeah, small pharma. And small biotech. Some are willing to learn, others are not, and big pharma, I think, is the same thing. Just probably different how they express that. Jeff, for us, obviously, license out and partnering with big pharma is an important exit, an important step. How do you factor your CDMO choices into that?
Actually, you're just challenging that thinking right now. So as I think on my feet, I would say I could see a strategy where having a more established CDMO, knowing that I have the hopes to out-license this at phase 1 or phase 2 would make more sense, because that partner that now doesn't have, well, gee, I've now got to invest another $20 million to pick this up and move it from point A to point B. So that would be my kind of very initial reaction to your question is I would want to have a more established CDMO.
Yeah, I think it comes also as a certain element of validation to what you're doing, and optionalities that you bring into it, and that brings me to another topic before I think we're coming closer to the end, is and I go back to you, Jeff, is the investors, right? I mean, how do they see having manufacturing versus being outsourcing your process? I mean, on your investor interactions, how do you dance around that topic?
What I've seen mostly of my experience in the cell therapy space over the last kind of 10 to 12 years is that investors are getting a lot more savvy in regards to your entire manufacturing process. I don't see quite as much emphasis points on whether it's done by a CDMO versus whether it's done in-house. But typically, people like us are going to naturally do it at a CDMO based on what we had earlier said. But they do really dig into long-term is, okay, you know how to manufacture for phase 1. Tell me what your manufacturing strategy is for phase 3 and phase commercialization. So having a good CDMO back to a partnership that has helped you think through that and has mapped that out would be extremely valuable.
And I'll start with you, Brian, today. From that perspective, I mean, do your clients come to you on discussions about the investors out position, or do you have a view on this mostly from the side that you're talking here from the CDMO? I mean, the investor perspective to the manufacturing, in-house, CDMO, and strategic approach to it along the development path.
We as a CDMO at Ipuscasi, we don't hear too much of our investors do not like A, B or C. Some of the things we do here in that regard are around royalty payments for various technologies which are linked to product sales. That seems to be a delicate topic, I would say, that gets vocalized, linked to our investors do not like. But we are seeing this translation of the longer term view. So as I mentioned earlier, from what had started a couple of years ago, we'll do a development package and we might come back to do some clinical lots. We see more and more companies now saying that we want to start with a development package. We want to see how this goes out through pivotal supply, through potential process validation, qualification, how you can help us with a submission, a launch, the first years of supply. And I think the investors are clearly behind that to say, pick the right partner, because we don't want to be chopping and changing partners the whole time, and take the time now to find the right person who can guide you out through those couple of years.
But Jeff, you made a very good point. I think probably 10 years ago when I started on cell and gene therapy, there was still the perception that one should have a manufacturing, and there was a value for the investor that you had your own manufacturing. But I think they understand now that the flexibility and the different stages, as long as you have a strategy, it's more, because they're getting more savvy, more used to it. I think we've covered. I probably would like if each one of you would say take-home message, right? Partnership, CDMO, strategy, thinking, risk into it. What would you say to those that will listen to our discussion is the takeaway message from how we're about an hour together here today?
My take-home message would be back to the partnership term that we've used quite a bit here. Really comes down to good, solid communication. So without good communication, you'll never forge a partnership.
You have to decide what you really want to outsource and have to outsource, and then you should really look for the partner that fits your need, where you see technical capabilities, where you see the scientific expertise, and where you feel you can establish a good and trustful communication.
One word we didn't float around here today is trust. right? So we could talk about partnership, but we haven't mentioned the trust. And I think the key takeaway is, work with somebody, whether it's a CDMO, whether it's an academia institution, it doesn't matter, but that can deliver what they promise and promise what they deliver and vice versa. So I think, that really goes back to the mutual agreement up front, the understanding, the challenging one another so that in the end you get what you're expecting and really build that foundation of trust for a long-term partnership to come.
I would agree with that, and I think it manifests in flexibility. We come from different sides, but we both want the same thing. We want, as a CDMO, a sustainable business, repeat business. We want to learn from it. We don't want things moving out with potential reputational issues. And the other thing is that given this field, which is very moving very fast and very immature, whether it be on the cell therapies or the gene therapy side, things are going to change. So if we trust each other and we're flexible, we will get there, because at the end of the day, we both want the same thing, reliable business and a product delivered to patients.
I think you've said it. I like the word trust, actually, because it comes and encapsulates a truthful partnership, right? I also like what you just said in terms of this alignment and this desire to work together towards an aim, the passion for it. I mean, and I think we all here come with different angles, but we all want a similar thing, which is have this field develop further and bring the value not only to the stakeholders that we represent, but above all, the stakeholders that we work for, which are the patients, right? And that passion, that trust, that collaborative spirit, and in fact, really being on something that is changing a lot, bringing challenges and opportunities and a lot of fun is really what brings us here together, right? So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I had a bit of fun.
Thank you.
So it's good.